Hello, this is Morale Bernard with the continuing story of A Christmas Story. Set in New York, there is a burglar, there's a blizzard, and now there is the burglar's sister. Last words were, "The best pipe I own. No, indeed, you'll take a horrid little one that won't draw. It will be just the thing for you." "No," said McVeigh. "No. You must give me the big one. Otherwise, I shall make it appear that you promised the other one to me, and turn mean at the last moment. And I can do it, Holland." His little eyes gleamed at the thought. "I shall say, 'My dear fellow, I'm glad you changed your mind about the meerschaum. It was, as you say, too handsome for a man in my position.' Now that will make her mad if anything will. You know, she's not quite satisfied with the way you treat me as it is." This was quite true, and Geoffrey, remembering that the object of the gift was to please the girl, reluctantly agreed to part with his favourite pipe. The affair went off well. McVeigh affected to hesitate over accepting so handsome an offering, and Geoffrey pressed it upon him with a good grace. As far as his present to the girl was concerned, he found himself less and less willing to make it in McVeigh's presence, and more unable to think of any way of getting rid of him except murder or the cedar closet. His anxiety was rendered more acute by the fact that once or twice he could not help suspecting that Celia, in spite of her anger, would have been glad of a few words alone with him also. Before very long, she suggested that McVeigh should take her hat and coat upstairs for her. "Certainly, I will," cried Billy, springing up with alacrity, and was at the door before Holland's warning shout, "McVeigh!" stopped him. "Let me take it up for your sister," he said warningly. "Oh, no, not at all. Let me," replied McVeigh courteously. "Couldn't hear of it," returned Geoffrey. By this time, they were both outside of the door, and Geoffrey closed it with a snap. "You would you?" he said angrily. "Now, Holland," said McVeigh, as one who intends to introduce reason into an irrational confusion, "this is exactly a case in point. I am by nature a gallant man. I forgot all about your instructions." "I wonder," said Geoffrey. "It was instinctive to do my sister the little favour she asks, yes, and I doubt if I should have acted differently if your pistol had been at my head. She asked me, that was enough. I've warned you once. Holland, I think you'll excuse my telling you that you have a very unfortunate manner at times." They went upstairs together, and were descending when Geoffrey stopped, with his eyes on the grand piano which stood in the hall below them. "Can you play?" he asked. McVeigh brightened at once. He had been looking a little glum since his last speech. "Yes," he answered, "I can. Well, I'm not a professional, you understand, but for an amateur I'm supposed to have as much technique and a good deal more sentiment than most." "I don't care how you play," said Holland. "There is a piano. Sit down and play, and don't stop." "No, Holland, no," said the other with unusual firmness. "That I will not do. No artist would. Ask anyone. It is impossible to play in public without practice. I have not touched the instrument for over a year. You can do all the practicing you like here and now. You can play finger exercises for all I care. All I insist is that you should make a noise so that I'll know you are there." "Well," said McVeigh, yielding. "You must remember to make allowances. Not the best musician could sit down after a year. However, I dare say it will come back to me quicker than to most people. You must make allowances for my lack of practice." "There is only one thing I won't make allowances for, and that is your moving from that music stool." He opened the piano, and McVeigh sat down, waving his fingers to loosen the joints. He sat with his head on one side, as if waiting to discover which of the great composers was about to inspire him. Then he dropped lightly upon the notes, lifting his chin, as if surprised to find that an air of Schubert's was growing under his fingers. Geoffrey was astonished to find that he really was, as he said, something of an artist. He waited until he was fairly started, and then returned to the library. "Is that Billy?" said the girl. "It must be a great pleasure to him to have a piano again. He's so fond of music." "He was not as eager to play as I to have him," said Geoffrey. He came back quietly and stood looking down at her for a moment. Then he said, stretching out his hand, "I want my Christmas present." "I have none to give you." "You had." "I changed my mind." "Why?" For the first time she looked at him. "Mr. Holland," she said, "you must think me singularly unobservant. Do you suppose I don't see that you dislike my brother? You refuse a pencil. You did refuse it plainly enough because Billy had given it to me. I will not offer it to you again." Okay. I know that Billy sometimes does rub people up the wrong way. But I should think anyone of any discernment could see that his faults are only faults of manner. She said this almost appealingly. And Geoffrey, unable to agree, turned with something like a groan and rested his elbows on the mantelpiece, covered his face with his hands. "Do you suppose that he does not see how you feel toward him? Are you by any chance assuming that he bears with your manner on account of his own comfort? You might at least be generous or acute enough to see that it is only for my sake that he exercises so much self-control. He does not want to make my position here more unendurable by quarrelling with you. It makes me furious to see what you force him to put up with, the way you speak to him and look at him as if he were your slave or a disobedient dog. His self-control is wonderful. I admire him more than I can say." "And is my self-control nothing?" he asked, without moving his hands from his face. "Yours? I don't see any exercise of yours. Circumstances have put us at your mercy. You are rich and fortunate, and as insolent as you choose to be. Self-control? I don't see an evidence of it." "No," he said, and turning looked at her with a violence that might have set her on the right track. Under his eyes she looked down, and probably in the instant forgot all that she had been saying and feeling, for when he added, "I love you," her hands moved towards his, and she made no resistance when he took her in his arms. McVeigh was left so long at the piano that he finally resorted to a series of discords in order to recall himself to Holland's mind. His existence, if he had only realized the fact, was so completely forgotten that he might have made his escape with a good half-hour to spare before either of the others appreciated that the music had ceased. Not knowing this, however, he did not dare stop his playing for an instant, until sheer physical fatigue interfered. It was at this point that the discords began and brought Geoffrey into the hall. The disposal of McVeigh for the night was a question to which Geoffrey had given a great deal of thought. The cedar closet presented itself as a safe prison, but in the face of McVeigh's repeated assertions that the air had barely sufficed to support him during his former occupancy, It looked like murder, to insist. Geoffrey finally, when bedtime came, locked him in a dressing room off his own room. The room was on the third floor, gave on empty space, and against the only door he placed his own bed, so that escape seemed tolerably difficult. And to all other precautions Geoffrey added his own wakefulness, although towards morning weariness triumphed over excitement and he fell asleep. He was waked by an insistent knocking at his door, and he heard his name called by Celia. He sprang up and found her standing in the hall. She was wrapped in the sable coat, but shivering from cold or fear. "There is someone getting into the house. I heard a window open and steps on the piazza below my room. What can it be?" Geoffrey flung himself past her. The instinct of a hunter joined to the obstinacy of his nature maddened him at the notion of McVey's escape. On the opposite side of the house there was a piazza, and on the roof of this a neighbouring window opened. He threw it back and climbed out. The snow had stopped, and the moon was shining, paling a little before the approaching dawn. Geoffrey could see a figure stealing quickly across the snow. There was no question of its identity. His revolver, which he had snatched from under his pillow and brought with him, he at once levelled on the vanishing form. His finger was on the trigger when he felt a hand on his arm. Leaning out of the window behind him, the girl caught his arm. "Don't fire," she said. "Don't you see it is Billy?" There was a pause, the fraction of a second, but momentous, for Geoffrey realised that all his threats to McVey had been idle, that with that touch on his arm he could not shoot. Nevertheless, he raised his voice and shouted thunderously, "McVey!" The figure turned, hesitated, saw perhaps the gleam of the moon on steel, and began to retrace his steps. Steadily, with the revolver still upon him, he moved back to the house. Under the piazza, he stopped and waved his hand. "I'm afraid they got away from us, Holland. I did my best." "There was a burglar then," said the girl, in the little whisper of recent fright. "By heaven, he shall not trouble you," returned Holland, with more earnestness than seemed to be required. Then he left her and went down to meet McVey. "You were just about half a second ahead of a bullet," he remarked, ushering him into the hall. To be caught and brought back is so ignominious a position that Geoffrey looked to see even McVey at a disadvantage, but looked in vain. The aspect worn was a particularly self-satisfied one. "I was aware I took a risk," he answered. "I took it gladly for my sister's sake." "For your sister's sake?" "Yes, and yours. Be honest, Holland. What could be so great a relief to you as to find I had disappeared? You are too narrow-minded, too honourable, you would say, to convince at it, but you would be delighted to know that you need not prosecute me. If I shot you, I should be saved the trouble of prosecuting. But at what cost? I refer to my sister's regard. No, the thing. If you had only been quick enough to see it, was for me to escape. It was a risk, of course, but a risk I gladly took for my sister's sake. I would take longer ones for her." "Do you mean that?" "Of course." "Then take this revolver and go out and shoot yourself." McVey looked very thoughtful. Then he said gravely, No, Holland. To take a risk is one thing, to kill myself quite another. I've always had a strong prejudice against suicide. I think it a cowardly action, and it would be no help to you. She would not believe that I had committed suicide. She knows my views on the subject and could imagine no motive. No, that would not do at all. I'm surprised at the suggestion. It is against my principles." "Your principles?" Geoffrey sneered. Nevertheless, he was not a little altered in opinion. It had been something of a shock to him to find that he could not shoot at the critical instant. It had shaken his faith in himself. He began to doubt if he would be capable of sending the man to state prison when Celia besought his pity. His own limitations faced him. He was not the relentless judge he had supposed himself. Yet, on the other hand, the remembrance of Vaughan and the other men he was representing held him to his idea of justice. "Sit down," he said, suddenly turning to McVeigh, "and write me out a list of everything you have stolen in this neighbourhood, and where it is and how it may be obtained. Yes, I know it is difficult, but you had better try to do it, for on the completeness of your list depends your only chance of avoiding the law. If I can return all properly, perhaps. I have a mine in Mexico, a hell on earth where you can go if you prefer it to penal servitude. There won't be much difference except for the publicity of a trial. I have a man there who, when I give him his orders, would infinitely rather shoot you than take any risks of your getting away. Which will you have?" "Can you ask Holland? Which will be easier for my sister?" "Sit down and write your list then." "An interesting occupation, mining," observed McVeigh as he opened the portfolio. After this, for a long time, nothing was heard but the soft noise of the pencil and an occasional comment from the writer. "A rare piece that I parted with it absurdly low, but the dealer was a connoisseur, appealed to my artistic side." Things had gone on thus for perhaps an hour when a step sounded outside and the doorbell rang. Both men jumped to their feet. "My God, Holland," said McVeigh, "if that is the police, keep your wits about you or we are lost." It was a revelation to Geoffrey to find how completely, as his alarm showed he had cast in his interest with McVeigh's, he stepped forward in silence and opened the door. Not the police, but a man in plain clothes was standing there. "I'm glad to see you safe, Mr. Holland," he said. "There has been great anxiety felt for your safety. I am a detective working on the Vaughan and Marheim case. I got word to come and look you up as you did not get back to the gardener's cottage the night before last." "The snow detained me," said Geoffrey slowly. Come in, friend," said McVeigh briskly. "You must be cold." It speaks well for the professional eye that the detective, after studying McVeigh for an instant, asked, "I did not catch this gentleman's name. Who is he?" There was a barely perceptible pause. Then Geoffrey answered coolly, "That is the man that you are after." "Are you crazy, Holland?" shouted McVeigh. "What? The Vaughan burglar? You caught him without assistance?" Envy and admiration struggled on the detective's countenance. "I must congratulate you, sir." Geoffrey allowed himself the luxury of a groan. "You need it," he said. "I am no subject for congratulation. I can't even prosecute him, confound him, for several reasons. We were at school together, and I can take no steps in the matter." "But I can," said the detective. "Indeed, it is my duty to." "No," said Geoffrey, "nor can you. This man cannot be sent to prison. Yes, I know it is compounding a felony. Well, sit down and we'll compound it." "I could not agree to anything of the kind," said the detective. "I don't see anything. I don't see exactly what you can do about it." Geoffrey was deliberate and very polite. "For reasons which I can't explain, but which you would appreciate, leave me no choice. I have to save this man from jail. If you intend to work against me, I shall simply let him escape at once. Don't draw your revolver, please. I prefer to be the only person with a weapon in my hand. He has made a list of all the things he has stolen, and I shall see that they are returned to their owners at any cost. Will you undertake to get him safely to a mine I own in Mexico. Once there, he can't get away. It is 45 miles from a railway. If you accomplish this, I will give you 10,000 to make up for the reward you didn't get. 5,000 down and 5,000 at the end of a year." "I don't know what to say," said the man. "It sounds like a bribe." "It is," said Geoffrey coolly. "I never received such a proposition," returned the man. "That scheme won't do, Holland," put in McVeigh. "Can't you see it lays you open to blackmail?" "From you," said Geoffrey. "I had thought of that, but you can't blackmail me at La Santa Ana, and if you can get away and come close to blackmail me, I'll put you in prison without a moment's hesitation. I shall be in a position by that time to take care of the feelings of the other people concerned." "You don't understand me," answered McVeigh. "I meant blackmail from this man." "Oh," said Geoffrey civilly. "I'm convinced he is not a blackmailer, and besides, he won't get his second 5,000 for a year. And as I was saying to you, after a year, I don't so much mind having the whole thing known. My reputation will stand it, I think, if yours and his will." "I'm no blackmailer," said this detective. "If I accept, I'll be on the square." "If you do, let me offer you a piece of advice," observed Geoffrey. "And that is not to take your eye off that man for a single instant. He is a slippery customer, and you run a fair chance of not seeing my money at all, if you give him the smallest loophole." The detective considered McVeigh carefully from head to foot. Then he said gravely, "Is there any way of getting to this place of yours by water? I don't see my way to taking this customer in a Pullman car. If he chooses to slip overboard from a boat, why, no one would be any the worse, unless maybe the sharks." Oh, join me for the next video of A Christmas Story. Join me for the next video. Look forward to seeing you there. And it will be the final part of A Christmas Story. The final video. Join me for the final video of A Christmas Story. I'll see you then. Morale saying bye for now.